Okay, so this video is here to explain what happens when you have Mars in the 8th house in your birth chart. What is Mars? Mars represents brothers, male friends, male, male friends and brothers. It represents blood, it represents weapons, it represents fire, it represents energy, how we take action and assert ourselves. It represents debts, it represents the land. Um, then we are talking about the 8th house. What is the 8th house? The 8th house is originally ruled by Scorpio and originally ruled by Mars. The 8th house deals with sex, death, the occult, secret, hidden, taboo, information, and knowledge. It deals with inheritances, because you can gain stuff through death. And this is a house of taboo because things like sex and death are things that most people, at least in older times, are things people didn't want to talk about, or you didn't really see talked about. Sex was stuff that was really hidden through dirty magazines and VCR tapes, and nobody even to this day really likes really dealing with or talking about and planning about death. But you gain things through death. And like I said, this house is also dealing with occult, but that's taboo knowledge too, because that is knowledge that you have to find on your own. And opposite of the 8th house, the 2nd house, which represents the thing that you come from. And all the things I just stated about the 8th house are things that you usually try to keep hidden or hide from your family. The 8th house also represents your in-laws and your spouse, and the things you can gain from them. You see, the 7th house is your spouse, but the 8th house is like the house. It's like, all right, boom, y'all married now, and these are your in-laws, and these are the things that you can gain through marriage. That's what the 8th house sort of is y'all sex life and all that stuff, y'all secrets, y'all family. Anyway, with Mars being in the 8th house, we see that naturally your energy would be driven and directed towards maybe exploring and learning and uncovering sexual, taboo, occult knowledge. So you might be someone with Mars in the 8th house who is interested in exploring, various sexual avenues. You might be curious to want to maybe, hop on OnlyFans and do your own thing if OnlyFans is still around through the test of time by the time this video ages on YouTube. You might be someone who might just be very kinky, interested in trying new sexual things. Mars in the 8th house, you might be someone who's curious in venturing and exploring, tarot and Reiki healing and astrology. Someone with Mars in the 8th house, your marriage might be a great source of debt for you, or you might incur a lot of financial loss upon your spouse and upon their family, because Mars is a significator of debts and loss. So it's very possible that once you get into a serious relationship or once you get married, maybe you might be someone who might be draining your spouse and her family of their assets, or you might end up losing your assets through through your in-laws family. Through your in-laws with Mars in the 8th house. Mars in the 8th house can also make you a healer. So like either a metaphysical healer or like a surgeon or a doctor. Because with Mars's 8th aspect, it looks at the 3rd house. And the 3rd house represents the hands, represents written communication. And the 8th house is, sex and death and the occult. And Mars represents knives and weapons and surgeries and all that stuff. And the 8th house can be associated with surgeries and stuff too. And with, like I said, Mars given its 8th aspect, because Mars looks at the 4th and the 8th and the 7th house from itself, we could see that Mars, the person with Mars in the 8th house, they can have an interest or great skills in wanting to heal or maybe injure and cut people with their hands possibly. With Mars representing written, with the eighth house representing, I mean, not the eighth house, my bad, with the third house representing written communications, the person with Mars in the eighth house might want to communicate and share their maybe occultic knowledge that they have gained. Or maybe they want to write novels, write books, or share on social media about their sexual exploits or about their mystical occultic adventures, or maybe their near-death experiences, because the eighth house represents death and Mars represents injuries and losses, and it's looking at the third house of written communication. So you might be someone who might really want to communicate and share your traumatic experiences, either in the form of books or through social media, or your sexual adventures and exploits on social media and all that good stuff. Mars' fourth aspect goes into the 11th house of large social network circles, organizations, and gains, and elder siblings. So we see that maybe the person with Mars in the 8th house, they would have an interest in wanting to integrate themselves into maybe groups and network circles in order to maybe acquire an abundance of financial wealth and gains, because I told you, with Mars in the 8th house, you might end up incurring a lot of debt through your marriage, through your relationship, or from your in-laws, or you might spend a lot of their wealth or whatever, and maybe in order to make that money back, in order to make that wealth back that you've lost and spent, you might try to maybe go and network with people and just put yourself out there into the world and maybe try to be a leader amongst people in order to sort of make gains and connections. And that is essentially what I see with Mars being in the 8th house in your birth chart. Like I said, Mars in the 8th house can make you naturally very sexual, possibly. Mars in the 8th house, that's just about all I can really think of. I'm pretty sure there's plenty of other things you can take from Mars in the 8th house, but that's basically my little analysis of Mars in the 8th house, and I hope that gave you great insight and clarity on what to expect if you have this placement in your own chart.